Your monthly subscription box from postflybox.com includes all the materials needed to tie a dozen flies, along with some extra goodies. The Utah Killer Bug is an adaptation of Frank Sawyer's Killer Bug, developed in the 1930s as a grayling pattern for use in the UK. There are many different ways to tie this fly. Here we're going to show you two. The first one starts with a size 12 scud emerger hook. After getting the hook firmly secured in the jaws of your tying vise, pick up the coil of solder wire and get hold of the bitter end in the fingertips of your left hand. Beginning at the hook barb, start taking touching wraps up the hook shank. After 20 or so, helicopter the wire to break it off close, then tuck in the tail at the rear end of the wraps. For thread, load a bobbin with a spool of red unithread. Get the thread started on the hook shank in front of the wire wraps. Pull the tag rearward over top of the wire, then take rearward thread wraps over the tag and the wire. When you reach bare hook shank, snip the excess tag off close. Continue taking thread wraps over top of the wire wraps in order to anchor them really well and to give the fly a mottled red underbody. End with your tying thread hanging at about the hook point. Pull an ample clump of killer bug dubbing from the packet. Use the dubbing to create a 3-inch long noodle on your tying thread that's tapered at both ends. It should be fairly substantial. Start taking wraps with the noodle so the dubbing begins well down into the hook bend, then take touching to slightly overlapping wraps up the hook shank to form the body of the fly, ending with bare thread behind the hook eye. Continue taking thread wraps to neaten things up and create a bright red head on the fly. Pick up your whip finish tool and use it to do a 5 or 6 turn whip finish, seat the knot well, then snip your tying thread free. A drop of head cement, here Sally Hansen hard as nails, applied to the bare thread wraps behind the eye will ensure they don't come unraveled, thus increasing the fly's durability. And that's one version of a Utah Killer Bug. The second version is tied on a jig hook and incorporates a slotted tungsten bead as well as wire wraps. This makes it sink especially fast. In theory, jig flies like this are less likely to get hung up on the bottom than those tied with traditional J-hooks. The basic tying procedure, however, is almost exactly the same as on the first version. Begin by inserting the point of the hook into the small hole of one of the slotted tungsten beads. Then work the bead around to the hook eye. Get the assembly firmly secured in the jaws of your tying vise, making sure that the longer, squared-off end of the slot on the bead faces down. For thread, here too, load a bobbin with the spool of red unithread. Get the thread started on the hook shank behind the eye and after taking a few wraps rearward, snip off the excess tag. Pick up the coil of solder wire with your left hand and insert the bitter end into the slot on top of the bead. Take tight wraps of tying thread to secure it there, then pass the coil to your right hand and begin taking wraps with the wire behind your tying thread. After 6 or 7 turns, helicopter the wire to break it off close. Continue taking thread wraps over top of the wire wraps to ensure they're firmly anchored to the shank. Pull an ample clump of the same dubbing as before free from the packet and use it to create a slightly shorter dubbing noodle on your tying thread than the previous version. Start taking wraps with the noodle so the dubbing begins right at the start of the hook bend, then tapers into a carrot shape behind the bead. At the back edge of the bead, take wraps of bare tying thread to build up a narrow hot spot collar. Reach for your whip finish tool and use it to do a 5 or 6 turn whip finish, seat the knot well, and snip your tying thread free. A drop of head cement applied to the exposed thread wraps behind the bead is critical, as without it, these wraps tend to easily come unraveled with use. And that's 2 versions of a Utah Killer Bug.